ladies and gentlemen, the idea of miracles as violations of the laws of nature originally, it seems to me, was created really not that much as a careful analysis of what a miracle would be, but as a tool for a quick argument against the existence of miracles of the type we know the laws of nature, they are well based on empirical science. Miracles would be violations of the laws, therefore there are no miracles. And we find, I think, this line of thought in Hume's inquiry. I think, I don't want to say much more about how his argument is to be interpreted, but in these sentences, I think we find this rather quick argument. A miracle is a violation of the laws of nature, and as a firm and unalterable experience has established these laws, the proof against a miracle, from the very nature of the fact, is as entire as any argument from experience can possibly be imagined. So he thinks of it as a knockout argument. He thinks of it as he contrasts it with arguments from experience. So it's a kind of a priori argument. It's based on the experience on which the laws are based, but it's not an argument from experience that would consider the evidence for or against the miracles in question. So there I think we find this quick argument, and Voltaire took this up a few years later in his dictionary, where he writes in the entry on miracle, a miracle is the violation of mathematical, divine, immutable, eternal laws. By the very exposition itself, a miracle is a contradiction in terms. A law cannot at the same time be immutable and violated. What's remarkable about that kind of argument is, of course, its a priori nature and its quickness. It's the attempt to make a very general claim, there are no miracles at all, by thinking about what laws are, and perhaps by thinking about what causation is. Of course, you could give a general argument successfully against the existence of miracles by arguing that there is no God. That would be a relatively plausible way of arguing, but it's remarkable that especially an empiricist like David Hume would argue that we can just take the evidence on which the laws are based and then think about laws and then conclude that there are no miracles, rather than that's of course a time-saving and an effort-saving strategy, because then you don't have to investigate all the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, for the reliability of Scripture, and so on, which of course were going on a lot at his time. So it's a quick argument, and it would be fascinating if they did work, but we need to question whether they do work, and I will argue that they do not work for the reason that miracles are not violations of the laws of nature. And I bring in free actions too, because similar arguments, at least on my accounts of miracles and of free actions, can be launched against free actions of these types. So my claim is that the whole idea that miracles are violations of the laws is wrong, and that therefore these quick arguments do not work. And it is wrong for a particular reason, namely that the understanding of the laws of nature that's on which the argument is based is wrong. I will first now briefly introduce what I mean by a divine intervention and by a free action, and I will be relatively quick, and it will be a controversial account, at least perhaps an unusual account of free action, but my excuse for making this short is that the kind of human free action and divine intervention that I will choose is the kind of free action and divine intervention that is most difficult to reconcile with the laws. So there we go. If an action, I start with the usual libertarian approach to free will. If an action was the result of a causal process, a non-probabilistic causal process, then it was not free, simply because that's the kind of thing we mean by an action being free. We want to rule out exactly the scenario, it was just my brain and other processes not under my control that brought about the action.
And so, yes, and so.
But also the approach with which refers to probabilistic laws to divine action, to human action, I think are not successful, because if a human action somewhere at some stage, at the stage of deliberation or at the stage of the bringing about of the action, if that process or if that action somewhere involved probabilistic processes, then that would make it true in some sense that the person could have done otherwise. It could have happened that the person does something else or does nothing. But it's, I think, quite clearly not the kind of could have done otherwise that we are looking for. We are kind of, he could have done otherwise that's enhancing responsibility and enhancing control of the agent. And it seems as if it was a probabilistic process that was involved in the action and that made it true that the person could have acted differently, then that's exactly a lack of control. Then it's a matter of chance what happens rather than a matter of what the agent chose to do. So I conclude that if it was free, then the action was initiated by an event which had no preceding cause. That is to say, if we take a bodily action, I raise my arm, then there is a causal process leading to the desired result of the action. That causal process has certain causes. It goes back a certain way through my muscles and through some nerves. And I say, if it was free in this robust, solid, perhaps ordinary sense, then there must have been some stage that was the first stage of that process. That is, of course, the things involved in that stage did exist already before, but that stage is the first stage at which there was a causal process directed at the desired result of the action, that is the rising of the arm. So of that first stage of this action process, there must have been an event that is a part of that stage that did not have a preceding cause. Of course, just saying that it did not have a preceding cause doesn't give the agent control over what he or she does. We need to add something extra. We need to add that the occurrence of this event, this initiating event, was due to the agent. And this due to the agent must be what we experience when we act, and it must be something that's special and characteristic of actions. And I call such an event a choice event. So a choice event is an event that has no preceding cause, but occurs through the agent. It is the action of the agent, or you can say it occurs through the action of the agent, but not in the sense that there is something before it which then causes it, but it is the action of the agent. It is the choice of the agent. Has no preceding cause, but the agent brings it about directly. Whether this is rightly called agent causation is a matter of debate, depends on what you mean. I therefore do not commit myself to that kind of claim. I'm just saying that there are in free actions these kinds of events, choice events that have no preceding cause but occur through the agent. And of course they must be related to reasons or to inclinations. Both are possible motives. And on other accounts, at least inclinations are causes of the actions. I would say the reasons or inclinations that motivate an action are of course related to it in the particular way. Reasons through this reason for relation, and inclination as the inclination towards relation. But they're related to it in some other way than by event or process causation. It's not something that you can that's governed by laws of nature and that you could study accordingly. It's something extra, just in order to say that I need to postulate these extra relations in order to link the choice event to the reasons or to the inclinations that motivate it. So this is my account of human free action. Now, divine interventions are a particular kind, perhaps a small group of small kind of divine actions. We heard about other special divine interventions. I'm entirely in agreement with Dr. Pinson that there is this perhaps bigger group of special divine actions, but I'm here, as I'm dealing with causation and laws of nature, I'm here addressing a particular divine interventions, and I say they are choice events of the kind described, but choice events by God, and they are events in the universe. Of course, if God creates a universe when there is no universe, then it's not an intervention. There is nothing there with which it would intervene, into which it would intervene. But if God acts in the universe, when something else would have occurred had God not intervened there, that is a divine intervention. In the case of God, he does that while he sustains the universe. So these two actions must occur at the same time in God. He must sustain the universe and then intervene in a process. And that he intervenes means that he brings about an action, an event directly, that is as a choice event, such that that choice event occurs instead of an event towards which a causal process in the universe was directed. And the choice event that God brings about stops that causal process through preventing this other event towards which the process was heading. So it's this notion of the existence of processes with a direction which I need in order to clarify what a divine intervention is on the basis of choice events. So that is why I treat here human free actions and divine interventions in parallel. They both involve choice events. In the one case, the agent is a human person, and in the other case, the agent is God. I could also bring in animals. I think they would also come in here, except that they don't have rational reasons, but you could easily tell how that would go then. Now, if such choice events were to exist, either human or divine, they would be violations of the laws. If the laws entailed regularities of succession, as David Hume, of course, presupposes. And by regularity, I have to emphasize, I mean here only regularity of succession. That's the only thing I'm arguing. And by regularity of succession, I mean something of the type, all events of type X are followed by events of type Y. It's got to be this, all events of type X are followed by events of type Y. That's what I call a regularity of succession. And if the laws of nature do entail regularities of succession, and a little extra needs to be made, namely the assumption that each event is an instance of a regularity of succession. Because it could be that there are some regularities of succession, but where there are human actions or divine interventions, these are events that are not involved in regularities of succession. No, it's the conflict with the laws occurs once you claim that the laws of nature entail regularities of succession and that each event is an instance of a regularity of succession. And if that's the case, then choice events are or would be violations of the laws of nature, because a choice event would exactly be that. It would be an event that occurs following a certain other event, say X, such that at other occasions when there is no intervention or no free action, the X would be followed by, say, a Y event. And in the case of the choice event, through humans or through God, the choice event is a replace that occurs instead of the event towards which the process was heading, and is stopping the process for that reason. And it would therefore indeed destroy the regularity of succession. And if it's so that the regularities of succession are entailed by the laws of nature such that we can be sure that they exist, then the choice events are ruled out by that. So choice events would indeed be violations of the laws of nature if the laws did entail regularities of succession, and if each event is an instance of a regularity of succession. And my thesis now is that laws of nature do not entail regularities of succession. And as you will know, that's contrary to what actually all prominent theories of the laws of nature today say. It's, of course, all the Humean accounts say that there are regularities of succession. In the David Lewis account, it's slightly more sophisticated, but it still boils down to that idea. And even on the David Armstrong account, he assumes that there are regularities of succession. And if I may suggest, as far as I understand, also Professor Mumford's account accepts the existence of regularities of succession. So I'm arguing against all these accounts in this respect. Now I need to present briefly what, in my view, a law of nature is. First, a brief point about the examples. Of course, we shouldn't do what early analytic philosophers did. They sometimes choose examples like all swans are white, or a bit better, but I think still deficient for an investigation of laws of nature and metaphysics. Metal expands when heated. Of course, these sentences exist, but we shouldn't call them laws of nature, at least not only in loose speaking. We should take we should take real ones. They can be simple ones. I choose the law of gravitation because Richard Feynman does so in the characteristics of laws of nature. And I thought if he does that, I get away with not using more complicated ones. So that's the kind of law I investigate. And I think that's a good starting point and a good example for a theory of laws of nature. There could, of course, be other laws of nature or some result of physics where one can debate whether it's a law of nature, and one has to investigate what exactly it is and whether it's exactly the same kind of law. But I'm using that example, and the extension of that would be a matter of debate. I use laws as they stand here, in this case with the F, with the force. I point out that laws are different from equations of motion. Equations of motion also, of course, have their place in physics, but it occurred to me at a certain stage of my work there that equations of motion are something different and that we need to give a different account. I did that because sometimes I got objections which then referred to equations of motion. So we need to say slightly different things about equations of motion than about laws. And by an equation of motion, I mean something of this form, which describes for a particular system that given all the forces that there are, or the numbering the forces that there are, given that they are there, and I would add on the assumption that there is nothing else acting on the things in question, the relationship, the sum of the forces is equivalent to the product of the mass and the acceleration. So I'm saying once you have descriptions of particular systems which make predictions about the system, we have to say things slightly different than about laws. These are not laws. I follow here or are in agreement with John Earman, and I think John Roberts was the other author, I can't exactly remember, who also points out and defends that difference and says that these are two different things. And Earman argues that applications of the laws require special conditions, ceteris paribus laws, or what Hempel called, can't remember now, something like that. And he says, but the laws of nature, like the law of gravitation, that's what really is the result of physics, and the others are only applications of the laws, these other equations. I mention that only in order to make clear that I'm looking here at laws like the law of gravitation. Could you bring me a glass of water, please? Okay. So now I want to investigate briefly whether we can find a regularity of succession that is entailed by the law of gravitation. And I will ask whether perhaps, if not that, perhaps all the laws together entail regularities of succession. But let me start with a simple question. Does this law entail a regularity of succession? So the first candidate would be you have two bodies and they accelerate towards each other with the force that we can calculate through the law. And so the candidate would be, do they all accelerate with this degree? And the answer is, of course, no, because there are other things acting on the bodies. Some may accelerate with that to that degree, but many two bodies who are attracting each other will not accelerate in this way, because there are other things acting on the bodies, in the simplest case, other bodies which attract the bodies with gravitation, or there could be Coulomb forces or other forces or free actions or whatever you believe in. At any rate, it's not true that whenever there are two bodies, they accelerate to this degree. That's not the case. We know that, and we all agree on that. Now, the one strategy to rescue regularities of succession is to include more in the X, to include more in the first element of the supposed regularity of succession. One way to include more is ceteris paribus clauses. The idea then is, well, we need to at least keep certain conditions constant. I think whether you say you keep them constant or you include them doesn't make much difference. At any rate, the question is, if we include more, if we say everything else has to remain the same or everything else relevant has to remain the same, can we then rescue our regularity of succession? If we add that condition, is it then true that the law plus this extra condition or the enlargement of the x, does it entail then a regularity of succession? The trouble is that whatever you include in x, in this cause or the first element, if you only include events or descriptions of events, something that actually takes place at that time, that does not entail that there is nothing else. It does not entail that there is not something else that affects also what happens afterward, that affects also the things that are being affected. So whatever events at the time in question you include in x, in the first element of the regularity of succession, there can be x events that are not followed by a y event. So at some occasions that x event is followed by a y event, but at other occasions it's not so. At least it can be that it's not so, because there can be other things in these other scenarios that prevent the y event or that prevent the x event from causing a y event. So the problem here is that no list of things entails that there is not a certain other thing. No positive descriptions of states of affairs will rescue regularities of succession. Now, even if you add to this first element of the regularity of succession, if you add, and there are no other things, so you say this is the case and that is the case, and actually there is nothing besides that, even in this extreme scenario, it wouldn't be true that the law plus that entails a regularity of succession, because there can be influences of other kinds, at least as far as when I'm looking only at one law, what I'm still doing here. Then, of course, there can be other kinds of forces, and I will bring in agents too. So just enlarging the cause won't rescue the regularity of succession. So even if you make ceteris paribus clauses big or powerful or something, that won't work, because there can be influences of a kind that are just not addressed by the law in question. So therefore no single law, even if you add ceteris paribus and what have not, even an exclusion, a totality clause, you won't get the entailment of a regularity of succession. So, but of course there can be other kinds of influences, and the least controversial would be other kinds of physical forces, Coulomb forces or whatever other forces there are. So we need to take these into account. The most natural first attempt is to say, well, we need to consider all the laws together, because only all the laws together capture all the kinds of influences that there are. With that, perhaps we can have the laws entail regularities of succession. We could be generous and assume a bit more. We can assume that material, spatial things exert no other forces than those described by the laws of nature. I think for our universe that's a hypothesis, not too implausible. I don't think it's necessary, because I think it's surprising at all that forces can be captured by laws of nature. I think it's quite remarkable that, for example, just by observing that there are two bodies with a certain masses and a certain distance, we can conclude through our knowledge of the laws that there are certain forces. I think there could be forces without this existence of laws, or without this possibility of us discovering laws of nature and forming laws of nature. But even if we grant that there are no other forces, at least contingently, with that, if we grant that the totality of laws describes all existing forces exerting by the material things, but still the problem is that there could be other material things. So we get back to the first problem. You need a description of the first element of the regularity of succession that's always open to the existence of other things, and they can always kick in and destroy the regularity of succession by, in some occasions of this an X-type event, bring about a different type of event. And of course, or not of course, more controversially, there could be influences of a different kind, and choice events would be the one I have in mind. So I would still say, well, you have the law, and even if you take all the laws and left aside this other completeness issue, we would have to recognize that there could be influences of a different kind, namely choice events. And there is nothing in the law and nothing in the evidence that supports the law that rules out these kinds of events. And therefore, choice events are also one reason why the laws of nature do not entail regularities of succession. But I emphasize they are not the only reason why the laws don't entail regularities of succession. Even without that, even if we were only looking at material things, they wouldn't entail regularities of succession, because entailment always would have to be so that it's not just a contingent fact that there is nothing else acting on the things in question, but it would have to be entailed by the laws. And if it's entailed by the law, there mustn't even be the possibility of additional things existing or of choice events. So the mere possibility of the existence of additional things and the mere possibility of the existence of choice events destroys the entailment. It makes it that the laws don't entail regularities of succession. And I think the result of that even looks quite simple to me. The totality of the laws of nature entails no regularities of succession. And I think instead of trying to form ceteris paribus clauses and making it bigger and include more laws, we should simply state that the laws entail certain conditional prediction statements of the following type. Laws entail statements of the following type: if an event is of type X and no further things are affecting what follows, then an event of type Y will follow. If we add that there is actually causation going on in the scenarios that the laws describe, we get that the following types of statements are entailed: events of type X cause events of type Y if nothing prevents them from causing. And here just a list of the kinds of things that can prevent the occurrence of the regularity of succession by making it that in one occasion where there is nothing else acting, the X event is followed by a Y event. In other occasions, it's not followed by a Y event by one of the following reasons. Can be due to non-probabilistic material processes, or due to probabilistic material processes, or it can be due to free rational or non-rational actions by embodied agents, or free rational or non-rational actions by non-embodied agents. And finally, regularities of succession can be prevented or destroyed, and they are not entailed by the laws because of the possibility of free rational actions by God. Now, to back up this, or to make it a little more plausible, this unusual account of the laws of nature, let me just ask in a relatively simple way what reason we have to believe that there are regularities of succession. And I think even by thinking briefly about whether there are regularities of succession, or even whether every event is an element of a regularity of succession, I think we can already see that that's an implausible hypothesis. So if we consider some small type of event, an event of this kind of size we would be looking at when we call something a cause or when we conduct an experiment. So consider some small type of event, some small event of a certain type X that is followed by and causes an event of type Y. Then I suggest probably at some other events of type X, they were prevented from causing a Y event by something, by one of the kinds of factors that I've listed there. So, and likewise, there can be X event in the future that are prevented from causing Y events. So I think if we think about it and say, well, okay, in this case, the X event was followed by a Y event and caused it. But we can quite easily see, well, in other occasions there may be X events, but the Y event doesn't follow just because there are other things acting in this other scenario. So if we look at events of ordinary sizes, we see quite quickly it's not even a problem of how you carve out which one you choose as the type of the event in question. You can make it smaller, you can make it bigger, you can include more in the cause or less. It would always be so that if you take that kind of event, if you consider all the other events of that type, there will be, at least possibly, occasions where something prevents the occurrence of the Y event. And I think in this case I'm suggesting not only possibly but actually. It's usually so that when there is an event of one type, there is an event of that type at some other occasion where it's not causing what it causes in this scenario. And if you try to look for regularities nevertheless by saying, well, we need to look at larger events, at larger complexes of events in order to take into account all the factors that are relevant for the existence of regularities of succession, then you run into the problem that you form event types of which you actually will find probably no other instance at all. In the most extreme case, if you take our universe and you take a whole stage of the universe, well, probably that kind of stage of a universe existed only once. There was only once a stage of the universe of that type. Probably. I'm now addressing only the question, do you think this universe is like that there are regularities of succession? And I'm saying if you look at small events, there will be many instances of that kind of event, but at other occasions there will be followed by different events than the one it's followed by here. And if you consider large types of events, there will be very few, only one instances of that kind of event, and either these will be uninteresting regularities of succession with only 2 or 3 instances, or there actually will be only once that kind of event. So there probably are, not only do the laws not entail regularities of succession, but there actually are in this universe no regularities of succession. It is of course true that this universe somehow is a regular place, and actually theists quite often are putting this forward and saying, look, there is so much order in this universe and regularity. Well, that may be true, but it's not that kind of regularity. It's not that kind of order. These kinds of regularities don't exist. And what I argued more carefully is that they're not entailed by the laws of nature. And that's so even if there are no agents. So that conclusion is that even the totality of the laws of nature does not entail regularities of succession. What the laws do entail instead is that are statements of the following type. If an event is of type X and no further things are affecting what will follow, then an event of type Y will follow. So what follows can be affected by further things, for example, by material processes, by human free actions, or by divine interventions. It's all the same with respect to that it's changing the outcome of a certain process, or that it affects what is followed to another event. And I conclude that therefore neither miracles nor free actions are violations of the laws of nature, and that therefore the quick arguments as we found them in Hume and Voltaire from laws of nature against the existence of human choice events, human or divine, are unsuccessful. In order to flesh it out a little bit, and because I have 5 more minutes, I think, do I? Is that right? Yes. Let me indicate at least what more positive things I would want to say about laws. I thus far said only that laws do not entail regularities of succession, and that therefore, I'm afraid, all these laws, theories of laws that are exist in metaphysics today, they're all wrong. What do laws say positively? I think we should have chosen a much more simple approach and look at the law and say what it says. And the first way of putting this would be that a law of nature says that there are forces of certain kinds in situations of certain kinds. I think if we look at the law of gravity or the law of Coulomb, that's what it says. It says whenever there are two bodies, there is a force attracting them of a certain size. We philosophers should always have said that's what the law says, and not think about regularities of succession, which I've argued don't exist. So that's what we should have said. There are forces of certain kinds in situations of certain kinds. Now, at least plausibly, I would suggest that neither human free actions nor divine interventions abolish any of the forces described by the laws. That is to say, if God were to move a stone, let's assume he moved the stone from the grave not through an angel, as the Gospels say, but he did so directly. So if God were to move a stone, would he abolish any laws, any forces through that? Perhaps that's possible. I think rather not. Certainly it's not necessary to assume that he did. The forces were all there. The force of gravity pulling the stone downwards was there, and also the tendency of the stone to stay where it was is also there. It's just that God moved the stone. So that means, what does the law of gravity say? It says here that there is that force. If God moves the stone, God does not abolish the force. Therefore, God moving the stone and thus a divine intervention is not a violation of that law, because it makes nothing false. And it's actually important to recognize that, because there is another view on which laws don't apply to miracles. And I would say that's actually not the case, because the force is actually there. So if we say there are sort of exceptions or so, I would say we miss out something. We miss out the truth, the empirical truth, that the force is actually there. So the forces are there. In my view, actually, the laws are necessary. So I would have to explain that. But I think the forces are there. Therefore, it is all true what the laws say, also with respect to the case where God intervenes, and therefore it's not a violation of the law. And I should add that in order to develop this into a full theory of laws of nature, we mustn't keep it with with forces. Forces are only one kind of thing. I think we need to broaden it. Forces are what laws say that are about the movement of bodies. I think there can be other kinds of changes which are governed by laws. So we need to broaden that. And in my theory of laws, I broaden it to what I call tendencies, or more recently I've changed the name to directednesses. What I'm there getting at is that we know the phenomenon of directedness of a process. We observe processes that have a direction. That's why we can predict how they will go if nothing intervenes. And we know also the phenomenon of directedness of things in time, because we know that things persist in time. I mean, bodies persist in time. A stone or this presenter continues in time, and it's not the case that we could look at this presenter and say, well, this is the presenter at time t. What could happen afterwards? Anything could happen afterwards. It could cease to exist. It could become a rabbit in my hand. Anything could happen. But we know the presenter is here, and it has a certain tendency to stay in existence, to remain what it is, to remain roughly the kind of thing it is. So in general, I'm getting at the world, somehow the physical world has a direction. There is something at one stage of this world which affects what comes afterwards. And that affecting what comes afterwards is involved in the persistence of things as well as in causation, and that is also one aspect of that is described by the laws of nature. So my more general account of laws of nature would be that they say that they exist certain directednesses of certain types in scenarios of certain types. So that was a brief summary where I would be going further into detail with my laws of nature, but my main claim was just that the laws of nature do not entail regularities of succession, and that therefore it's wrong to say that either free actions or divine interventions would be violations of the laws.
Thank you, Professor von Wachter. I now invite to the stage for a response Dr. Thomas Sukopp from the University of Siegen.
Dear Professor von Wachter, dear ladies and gentlemen, I hope I will not change into a rabbit in the next 10 minutes. I would like to express my gratitude towards Professor Daniel von Wachter for inviting me, and thanks to the team of IAP. To reply in just 10 minutes is not easy, especially in the following scenario. You would like to contradict in many respects. You disagree and you do not know where to start. My reply has two parts. In the first part, I briefly list some points that show some lines of disagreement. I will partly agree for the sake of the argument. It would have been less instructive had I simply taken the views of some atheists, materialists, and determinists, or simply added another label by arguing from a naturalist's point of view. On the other hand, I have been in two minds about not expressing any doubts about some of the presuppositions and hypotheses that Daniel von Wachter thinks are true or at least plausible. So, part one, on what I do not agree, but for a moment leave my doubts aside. First, miracles did not occur. I do not believe in miracles because there is no need for divine intervention if a perfect Almighty God exists. Moreover, I think that reports on miracles do not absolutely prove that such things really did occur. Second, I do not think that God, even if he exists, has all the characteristics that Daniel von Wachter examines in his marvelous books, The Causal Structure of the World. For the sake of the argument, I will assume that theism as Daniel von Wachter worked it out, is a sound position. Third, I think that religion and science cannot be reconciled. There are deep gaps between the scientifically accessible world and the realm of God. The universe is reigned by natural laws, while the transcendent sphere of God is supposed to be a non-physical and non-physically accessible entity or realm. Fourth, if God is a person with a non-physical body, one may ask where exactly this eternal entity is located. This question, however, cannot be answered. Maybe it is a question that results from my distorted views on God. And fifth, free human action and free divine action cannot easily be compared. And the freedom of human action does not mean that any free action has no preceding cause. I do not believe that human action is provoked or initiated without any cause. Apart from this and other philosophical trifles, I totally agree with Daniel von Wachter. I will now focus on one particular aspect for the rest of my reply. My argument is about the status of natural laws and a question as to whether a violation of natural laws entails regularities of succession, ROS. Now, point 2, choice events, ROS, and the nature of natural laws. The force of Daniel von Wachter's argument results from his rather strict view on choice events. To make it explicit, under which conditions a choice event is a violation of natural laws, he assumes that first, it was initiated by an event which had no preceding cause. Second, the occurrence of this event was due to an agent, that it was the agent's choice. And third, the reasons or inclinations are related to the choice event, not by the event or process causation. This view is attractive, and I cannot claim to have a new argument against it. But I will nevertheless give you a clue why it is not plausible to me. Free action and of an agent results from the will of this agent. who has alternatives and is an intelligible agent. But this agent is acting in this world, and an act of free will, from my point of view, results from deliberations. So far it sounds trivial, but the next sentence will be not that trivial. It may also result from a spontaneous impulse to act, which, however, stems from deliberations and rationality, with the latter being bound to brain processes. But maybe there are uncaused brain processes. I cannot exclude this possibility, but this freedom seems to me close to capriciousness or random events. Now, to ROS. The question is not if natural laws entail regularities, but whether we can detect some ROS in the laws of nature. Daniel von Wachter has proposed a theory of tendencies relating to natural laws that is quite attractive, and I cannot focus on this theory here. The argument on ROS relies on the assumption that there can be, taking the laws of gravity, something that impedes two bodies with masses m1 and m2 to move as the law of gravity would predict. Yes, that is true, but it does not undermine ROS. The predictive force of laws, for instance, the law of gravity, is a result of ROS, or at least laws of gravity or laws of nature in general and ROS are closely related. Daniel von Wachter is perfectly right that there can be, quote, other things of influences of the body's movement, for example, electromagnetic forces, unquote. And yes, forces are additive. But with respect to the law of gravities and other laws, it does predict clearly and so far reliably, let's say, the position of the Earth, the Moon, and the Sun at 9 p.m. next morning. The argument that scientists isolate objects and simplify nature in experimental settings is also no argument against ROS. An iron ball or whatever in a vacuum will always fall if no impeding forces occur. This is enough for assuming that ROS, of course, another version of ROS, is, as far as I see, a fruitful assumption. Of course, some laws of nature, or even the most laws of nature, do not entail ROS simply because some laws have no time component. Now, my last remarks is about the nature of natural laws. If God is almighty and if he is the originator of natural laws, he could violate these laws. Maybe he could. But if he does it, he is maybe not perfectly rational. Why? God could have created a universe that is governed by God's natural laws. These laws imply a perfect fine-tuning of every component in the universe. Owing to this perfect fine-tuning of the universe, there is no need for intervention of God. You might argue that his almightiness, in combination with his absolute freedom, implies that he could simply invent every time he wants to invent. You might argue that even if God is almighty, he could not have foreseen a scenario where his invention is necessary, because God can only foresee in case where he could have known what will happen. He knows everything, but only everything what can be known. From a more pragmatic or let's say down-to-earth view, I think that laws of nature are partly the inventions of human beings and are partly discovered. One characteristic of nature, of the nature of these laws, is that they are not perfect descriptions. of the behavior of natural systems. They are valid as far as they can explain and predict the behavior of natural systems. In fact, the nature of natural laws clearly rests on metaphysical assumptions. On some of these assumptions, Daniel von Wachter and I obviously do not agree. Thank you for your attention. Thank you again to Daniel von Wachter.
Thank you, Dr. Sukopp. Professor von Wachter, would you like to give a reply?
Yes. Thank you. Let me start with the last point, or one before. You said the predictive force of laws is due to regularities of succession. I think that doesn't even take into... I think we do also, when we make predictions, know and find out that they are conditional on something intervening. Of course, when it's about a solar eclipse, then God would have to intervene, so that would be a rather big one, so we don't experience that very often. But with predictions at a smaller scale, I think there also our practical experience of predictions confirms that there is that possibility that something intervenes. Or, to put it the other way around, if we make predictions, we need to isolate somehow the scenario, and only there the prediction applies. So I think also the nature of predictions, actually, because if it were due to regularities of succession, there wouldn't be that possibility of not coming true, and there wouldn't be that necessity to either make conditions or to isolate the system. I think I will restrict on because I will stick to what I said and leave it there with respect to regularities of succession, strict view of choice events, where is God located? This would all be two big issues now. Religion and science cannot be reconciled. I can't, of course, deal with this in depth, but just to indicate, I think where that picture arises, that's usually because science is connected to some other metaphysical thesis, which then is in tension with religion. Either it's due to determinism being connected to it, or it's due to materialism being connected to science. And I think both would not be, presupposing either of these would not be good science, because science has to also search for causes and be open with respect to the results. And it's a metaphysical claim to add these. And I think in particular, of course, I think with this a kind of account of laws of nature, it becomes more clear why science and religion are not contradicting each other, in the sense that you could just look at science and therefore know that religion is false. No, my point is you need to investigate the evidence for the existence of God and a particular religion, and that's so because science is open to interventions, because science needs to make these conditional clauses all the time anyway, and they are open to divine causes. So that's what I would want to say there. Miracles did not occur. Well, that's an empirical question. Professor Swinburne wrote a great book on the resurrection of Jesus. I also think that the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus is underestimated. I think once you look at the evidence, first for the disciples really believing that he rose from the dead, and that is why they believed that Jesus is the Messiah, and that they saw him risen from the dead. I think once one looks at the evidence for that and then tries to explain that, then it becomes much more difficult. So there's just my point that evidence, I think, is relatively strong. Thank you.